This, of course, is a day that has been designated by Congress to celebrate motherhood, celebrate the idea and give thanks and acknowledge mothers in our society. I used to really feel that if you talked about something that was kind of giving credence to the idea this is a religious holiday, which of course it's not. It is a national holiday that is established by Congress. But over a period of time, I've kind of gotten to the point that I have about decided that you really talk about things that are on people's minds. And for that reason, I've gotten to where, generally speaking, I will talk about mothers on Mother's Day and fathers on Father's Day because people are thinking about that at that time. I want to begin by talking about something that I think is important. You know, have you ever stopped to think about, there's two areas of science that this would be very applicable. If you think of what makes up the universe, and you think of the knowledge that we now have, I mean, as you've taken science classes, you've looked at atoms, and when you look at atoms, then you begin to look at the nucleus of them, the protons and electrons, and then they're really breaking it down beyond that to some form of energy at the present time. Think about this. How long has that information been around? I don't know exactly. I'm not enough of a student of science history to know. But I do know this, that before the invention of many of the modern telescopes in the 20th century, such knowledge was not there. So when men looked at things, they would think in terms of, like, if you looked at sand, you'd think a grain was the smallest quantity of sand. Well, that's just not true. And now we know that to be true. Why? Because we began to look more and more into the details of things. If you look at space, it's the same thing. Some people don't realize it. But this argument that the Bible makes statements that are not backed up by scientific information is not a new one. In fact, before the invention of the telescope by Galileo, there were men who had read the Bible and said that the stars was innumerable, that you couldn't number them. And they argued that that was a proof that the Bible was not inspired, because they said if you went down, set out outside, and began to map out the heavens, that you could count about 3,000 stars. Now, I've never tried it, so I don't know if they're accurate in that or not, but that's what they said. But, of course, as we began to look through telescopes, we began to realize that to the naked eye, what appears to be one star may be 10,000 stars. So we really can't number them. And then as we've begun to develop capabilities with sending satellites into space, we've discovered that the telescopes that we have can't even see the end of space. So we don't really know how many stars there. There's no way that we can enumerate them. We just don't have the capability. The point I'm making is, though, that sometimes if we look at an overview, we see a few things, but we don't see a lot of detail. And sometimes we begin to look at even passages that we've studied over and over and over. If you begin to examine them more closely, you find things that you might not have realized were there before when you looked at them trying to get an overall picture. Have you ever seen a picture that someone shows you that has what is kind of a subliminal image in it, and when it's pointed out to you, you can see it? That's pretty common. Painters quite commonly have done that. They make paintings of that you look at and you think, oh, that's showing a man or a woman or men and women or a dog or whatever. And you begin to look at it closer when someone points it out to you, and you realize there's more there than might as first meet the eye. So we're going to talk about motherhood this morning. And we're going to talk about the reward is in a job well done. And we're going to look at 3 verses, 28, 29, and 30. We're going to include other verses in our study, but these 3 we're really concerned with. How many times have you been, particularly to a funeral of some godly woman, and this passage beginning in verse 10 through verse 31 will be read, and kind of an overview picture given of it. But I want to focus more on the idea of praise that's given in this particular lesson, and to try to take apart these 3 verses and look at them very, very carefully and see what we might learn. A good mother is one of the greatest blessings a person can have. And someone says, well, she's the greatest blessing. Well, when you start thinking about the greatest, that's pretty difficult sometimes to determine. But your relationship with God, would you value that more than a good mother? Well, there can be argument in those areas. But to say that a good mother is one of the greatest blessings a person can have is an indisputable statement. There's absolutely no question that this is true. If you read these verses, it says, her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Now, if you notice in this passage, it's talking about praise. It's talking about giving credit. It's talking about honoring. It's talking about setting someone, if you please, upon a pedestal. That's really the idea in all 3 of these verses. Praise in verse 28, in verse 29, and then praise in verse 30. I want to go back a little bit in the Old Testament to the 127th Psalm. Pretty familiar to many of you. The 127th Psalm has many applications. I want to read it, and I want to think with you about the application to our homes. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Notice what he said. He said, if you're going to build a house, and he's talking here not about a physical structure, he's talking about a home. And he said, if you're going to build a home and you pay no attention to the Lord's instructions, then you're fighting a losing battle. In our world today, one of the problems that we have is that we have a lot of folks who are trying to read something different. So that sometimes you say, well, so-and-so has 2 mommies, or so-and-so has 2 daddies. So we're redefining what we want. But we really need to pay a little attention to what God said. If you go to a financial advisor that you trust and who has a great deal of expertise, and he gives you some financial advice, and you leave and do exactly the opposite, and then you fail in your financial endeavors, who's at fault? Well, it's not him. He gave you the right advice, you just didn't follow. When we see homes in our nation that crumble and fall, and the people who are involved in them are paying no attention to the instruction that God has given, who's at fault? It's not God. And we need to realize that. We need to understand it. He says, unless the Lord has a hand in our homes, they'll not meet the needs of the people who live within it. They just will not. It will not be what it ought to be unless we pay attention to what the Lord instructed us. He created us and He instituted marriage and He gave the principle of motherhood. And while we may perceive ourselves to be wise individuals, we certainly do not measure up to the wisdom that God has. So when we begin to think about this topic of motherhood, one of the things sometimes I don't know that people do is when they're thinking about getting married. If you're a young man, you're thinking about getting married, does it ever cross your mind that the woman that I marry, you know the old song, first comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes the baby carriage. Well, that's kind of the way it should be, the way it is. And so all of a sudden, you find that the person that you marry is not only going to be your wife, but she's also going to be the mother of your children. And then there comes this reality that kind of sets in on you, that you begin to realize that what you're doing is you're taking the greatest responsibility that you have, and in many situations you are completely entrusting it to someone else. In other words, to your wife, who is the mother of your children. I mean, if you have a person who's, let's just say, use a situation where a person's a stay-at-home mom. Who spends time with the children? Husband works 8 hours, travels 2 hours to and from, gone 10. He sleeps for 8 of the 24. That only leaves him less than 6 at best to be around his children. How much time does the mother spend with them? You stop and you think about it, you kind of understand the point that he's making. You're going to entrust this woman with the thing that is the most priceless thing in your life, and that's your children. In the 31st chapter of the book of Proverbs, back up in verse 10, it asks this question: who can find a virtuous woman? And then it says this: her price is far above rubies. If you were to ask me what is the most valuable thing in my life, I would not say my house, and I would not say my truck, or my business. I would say my wife. Because that's the truth. And it goes on to say that the heart of her husband does safely trust in her. Have you ever heard someone say in a conversation, there's an individual that runs around on his wife, or a woman that runs around on her husband, and then they marry the person that was their run around with partner? And you ever heard someone say, you know what, if they'll do it to you, if they'll do it to them, they'll do it to you? How much do you trust a person in that situation? That's the point he's making. You're putting trust in this person to an absolute degree. I mean, just think of the situation we see on the news where, and we're talking about mothers this morning, so we kind of confine it to that, where a mother murdered her children while the man was at work. He safely entrusted his children to her. And that's an extreme case, I understand that. But it kind of demonstrates what this passage is talking about. Ephesians 6:4 says that fathers should bring their children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Does that mean that the fathers are the sole hand and that they're to do everything necessary to make sure that their children are instructed? From a practical standpoint, how many Bible classes have you ever seen in that room that's taught by a man? Any of you men ever tried it? I got forced into a situation one time of teaching a small class of children. And I found out I wasn't very qualified for that. And so I kind of went and told the people, you know what? If y'all going to, of course, they believe that women couldn't teach Bible class, and we're having that big controversy in the congregation I was in, believe it or not. And I said, you know what? If you somebody else going to teach that class, not going to be me. In fact, I'll be honest, about 15 minutes of it, and I told them all, let's go play under the shade tree. I really wasn't very qualified for that. If you look at most of the teaching of small children, who does it? Now, people argue, well, that's just sexist. Whatever you want to say. I'm not arguing anything except reality. And you stop and you think, you fathers provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Do you not, as a man, have a responsibility of marrying a woman who will become a mother of children, who will help and aid and assist you in bringing your children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Is that not what this passage in Proverbs chapter 31 is really, to a great degree, stating to you when it says the husband does safely trust in her? The heart of the husband does safely trust in her. You know, I've never had any fear of that. I trust Pat. I trust her with our kids, with our money, with everything else. Because I believe that when I chose her to be my wife, that I accepted the fact that I'm choosing someone that I trust. And that's a requirement of it. So just stop and think. Oh, a mother's a great blessing. Not only to the children, but also to the husband that she has borne those children to. Well, let's think for a moment. When you choose a woman to be the mother of your children, you have to seek someone you can safely entrust the greatest responsibility you'll ever have. Rightly so. Because one thing we need to think about is this. When you look at verse 28, I understand that Mother's Day is a day, and some people will say, well, why does a husband give his wife a gift or buy her a card or say Happy Mother's Day? Why? She's not his mother. Read verse 28. Her children will rise up and call her blessed. They're so thankful to have her as their mother. Her husband also. And he prays with her. Why? She's not his mother, but she's the mother of his children. And he's entrusting the most priceless thing in his life to her. And as she carries through with that trust and conducts herself appropriately, certainly it's in order for husbands to say to their wives, Happy Mother's Day. Or to give them a gift or whatever it is that you might do. Because after all, stop and think of what part she plays in this. She's the greatest blessing that a person can have, a good mother. One of the greatest blessings. One of the greatest blessings that a man can have is to have someone he has the confidence that will be that good mother. Something we learn, I believe, in this passage. I'll tell you something else that's interesting. Sometimes people say things and you say, well, you're not really not true. You ever notice that when little children write a Mother's Day card, they will a lot of times say to the best mother in all the world. Well, you got 28 kids in the class in school to 30, and they all say the best mother, and you say, well, they can't all be the best mother, but I'm going to tell you something. What's really important about that, how many mothers do they have? That child who wrote the card to the best mother in all the world, how many mothers does he have? He has one. So what is he or she talking about when they say to the best mother in all the world? They're talking about that relationship that they have. You know, mothers who conduct themselves as they should, their children, and it's not uncommon for them to say to the best mother in all the world. Is that something that's unusual? Well, stop and think about what this writer wrote. This writer wrote, many daughters have done virtuously, but thou shallest them all. It's unusual for us to think in those terms. Look at the words. The writer said, but thou excellest them all. So it's not unusual for you and I to look at our mothers or to look at our wives and say, you're the best. And it should be that way, and here's the reason why. I want you to go back for a moment to the book of Exodus. Look at the Ten Commandments. When it comes to the relationships that people have and how they're governed by God in this particular chapter, there's 6 of them, really, things that talk about our responsibility toward man. They began there in verse 12. And in verse 12, the first thing he said is, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the earth. Have you ever heard a child say, I know that you've seen it at least in movies and TV shows, where they'll go to their mother and say to them probably one of the most hurtful things they could ever say. Why can't you be like so-and-so's mother? Sometimes that may be deserved, but it's still hurtful. You know, we really need to be careful about our statements sometimes when we think about our mothers. Well, we need to be careful that we realize that God said we honor our father and mother. And that would not give us leave to say, well, you know, why can't you be like so-and-so? Many times that may have some merit. But many times it doesn't. Many times it's just a childish to be like so-and-so's mother because they let her do it. Now, we're talking about situations where mothers treat their children well. When you get into areas where people don't live up to their responsibility, I'm not quite sure what you do with that. I don't know. But we're talking to people who are in, shall we say, normal circumstances. And you'll notice that when you come down to verse 17, when he said, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, one of the things he said, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. There are too many women that would want their husbands to say, well, I don't know why you can't be like so-and-so. I'm pretty sure that's not going to go over well because that really is akin to the idea of coveting. In other words, I kind of wish I'd have married her, not you. That's kind of what it comes down to if you're not very careful. It's normal to think in these terms, and we ought to. We ought to think of how blessed we are to have this wife to be the mother of our children as she does the right things. We ought to think of how great it is to have that mother and to bless her and honor her and not throw insults toward her by saying, I'm just coveting somebody else's mama. I'm coveting somebody else's wife. That would be a very bad thing indeed. We need to be very careful. Of course, that puts a great deal of responsibility for women to live up to. Because if your child says to you, sometimes when you have people really just horrible parents, mothers particularly in this case, we're talking about Mother's Day, and their little child comes home with a card that says to the best mother in all the world, and she looks at her wife and said, who, me? It does put a lot of responsibility upon us. If somebody's going to look up to us, we need to be very careful. It's a humbling experience to realize that these little people that we're guiding are looking to you for guidance. Normally, if a child is in a home where there's a stay-at-home mom, and this would be true more than so in any other case, but you do realize if a person's a stay-at-home mom, she doesn't work outside the home at all, and she's just there. From the time that child's born until they turn 5 years old, there's one constant in their life every single day that has the most influence upon them. The Catholic Church used to say, give me a child till they're 5 and then you can have them because they're pretty well molded. Well, if that's true, then just think of the tremendous responsibility that you have. Whether you work outside the home, whether you don't, you still have a tremendous responsibility because even then, children go and someone's babysitting, they still know who their mama is. And their mama still carries a lot more weight than the babysitter in most cases. So what you see there is that mama is put in that position, and it ought to be a humbling position to realize what a tremendous influence they have. The old expression, like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, there's a lot of truth in it. I want to go back to the 22nd chapter of the book of Proverbs. In verse 6, you probably will recognize. But to me, it's sometimes unfortunate that we read only one verse. Because verse 6 says, train up a child the way he should go. When he is old, he'll not depart from it. But there's a lot in verse 1 through 5 that we need to pay a little attention to. First thing he says is this: a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. I'm going to tell you something. The inheritance that you need to thank your parents for is not whatever monetary figure was left to you, whether it be great or whether it be small. But the thing you need to thank your parents the most for is the character they've helped you to develop in your life. And mothers who help you to develop good character, that's what's important in life. And that's what he's telling you. The rich and the poor meet together. Now, he just clarifies it for you. It doesn't make any difference. It's not even important. If a person lives in the fanciest house in town, and his father and his mother have the highest income, or they live in the poorest section of town and they may be in the lower income, that's not what's important. What's important is the character that's imparted to you. He goes on to say, a prudent man foreseeth the evil, hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. But humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor in life. Think of that. Thorns and snares are in the way of the froward. He that doth keep his soul should be far from them. And then he said, train up a child. Did you notice the word humility in verse 4? You know, I can remember some years ago, and I've repeated this so many times you've heard it, I'm sure. The first time I ever baptized anyone, I remember clearly. It was in Florida at the Oak Grove congregation. And I actually, after I baptized her, I sat down and I thought to myself, you know what? If you told her something that's not true, you just condemned her soul to hell. That's a serious problem. You need to think and give a lot of consideration to what you're doing. Parents are kind of in the same position. They have to know that what we're doing is important, has a tremendous impact. And I used to believe this passage meant you could never fail, but then I began to realize that, you know what? God made us all free moral agents. So you can have a child that's raised correctly and then one day falls victim to temptation and sins. And I don't believe parents account for that. But on the other hand, something that people need to stop and think about, if you were to go examine the crime records in a state, you know something you find out that's really kind of tragic? They tend to follow a family tree. Just think about that, and it's true. A child grows up in the home and all there is drugs and selling drugs and all that. What do you think's likely to happen? Train up a child. And the mother needs to realize, yeah, your child thinks you're the best thing that ever was. Be the best thing that ever was. There's one thing that's indispensable to deserving praise, and that thing is fearing God. In this passage, in verse 30, he says, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain. It's kind of interesting to notice what's stated there. I looked at the New International Version, and it actually says charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. What he's saying is you can be charmed by people who are wicked. People who are wicked can be beautiful. Now, this passage doesn't have anything to do with beauty from the standpoint of who's righteous and who's not. I know when I was a kid, there was a popular song out, and I don't remember who sang it, but I still find myself singing it sometimes because it's kind of cute. Go from my personal point of view, get an ugly girl to marry you is one of the lines in the song. That's not what this is talking about. If you look into the Old Testament and you look at one of the most godly women that you'll ever see, it would be Esther. But she also was stated to be the most beautiful woman in the entire kingdom and was chosen in a beauty contest to have the charm and the beauty that the king desired her to be his front for his kingdom as his wife. So it doesn't mean that ugly people are all great people and beautiful people are all wicked people. That's not what it means at all. It's kind of like going back to Psalms 22 where it said, you know, poor or rich doesn't make any difference. That's really not the question. It's the fear of the Lord. Beautiful or ugly is really not the question. The question is the fear of the Lord. You know, when you stop and you think about this particular idea, likability and beauty may deceive, but it's the fear of God that qualifies you to be a good wife and a good mother. That's just a fact. And we need to realize it, and we need to understand it. If we don't have the fear of the Lord, we will not be what that child needs, period. And mothers need to realize that as well as fathers. But this is Mother's Day, so we're talking predominantly about mothers, and we're reading a passage about mothers. You know, if you've been so fortunate as I've been to have such a wife and mother, and you know, you go back to the idea of somebody say, well, did you go choose Pat because she's a godly woman? In part, but here's the truth. The truth is, when I was growing up, I dated lots of folks who did not have qualities that I desired to make a part of my life as a wife, and so I had no intentions of marrying her. When I saw her first time, what do you think the most important thing to me was? Boy, she's a good-looking woman. I just thought she was. But in conversation, over a period of time, I learned that she also was a godly woman, and therefore I decided, you know what, this is a woman I want to marry. We have to realize that it's not the outward appearance. It's really what a person is within that's important. Beautiful or ugly makes no difference. The difference is whether a person fears the Lord. People make the mistake of reading this and saying you shouldn't marry somebody because if they're pretty, they're going to be wicked. And that's not true. What it's saying is that is not the important characteristic. But now, think about this. If you're so fortunate to have a wife and mother like that, I want to read the New International Version translation of verse 31. Because I think it really puts it right on the mark. Give her the reward that she has earned, and let her works bring her praise in the city gate. Let me stop and think with you. If you know mothers, godly women, you get together and you talk with them, what is the first thing they won't tell you about? First thing. If they show you a picture, what's the first thing they're going to show you a picture of? It'll be their children. Always. I kind of think in this passage, what he's really saying is the greatest work of her life is shown in the lives of her children. And the most valued praise to her came from them. Someone in the community says may give you a thing, the most outstanding citizen in the community. But I tell you what, does that compare to when your child's in kindergarten and come home with a handprint and says to the best mom in the world, which one's the most important to you? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years ago now, which one are you most likely to have in a chest somewhere that you pull out and look at? A plaque that they gave you said Employee of the Month, or a card that says Best Mother in the World? Which one? I think when you read this passage, sometimes it's one of those situations that, as I said, we sometimes read it, we get an overall view, and sometimes it's important, like in scientific discovery, to go back and look at it in more detail, the specifics of it. People are going to honor mothers today. If we're worthy of honor in the eyes of God, it would be because we have raised our children with an understanding that they were formed by God in His image, and that we, as a potter, are molding something, and that's what's important. But I just thought there were some important thoughts there that ought to be discussed, that we ought to look at, and we ought to think about. You know, I've often thought, when you look at Mother's Day and Father's Day, do you know which came first? Mother's Day, long before Father's Day was ever invented. If you listen to all the songs that you hear sing, there's a few like Daddy's Hands, but I can tell you right quick, there's a whole lot more of them that are written about how important your mother was to you. I mean, it's something that women really need to consider. They need to think about it, and it's something that children need to realize what a great blessing you have. Instead of getting mad because your mama won't let you do something you want to do, understand your mama has your best interest at heart, and she's doing what's in your best interest. And and you realize that to be so. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. I know we haven't had a first principle lesson. I realize that. Don't always have a first principle lesson. But we always try to give people an opportunity. You know, if you're a person who knows and understands your obligation to God, you realize the teaching in the New Testament that if you're lost in sin, that you have the obligation to repent, confess, be baptized for the remission of those sins, then certainly we would always give you that opportunity in any assembly into which we come. Think about that as together we stand.